Let me put the pen down so I don't play with it. All right. So last week we got into, or continued on in Job 38. We talked about how this section of Job is a little different from the others in that it's God speaking. And we talked about how in the past, there's been error in what's been being said. Not error in what's written in the Bible because it's inspired, but the people who are being recorded and what the things they're saying, there was certainly a lot of error in that, in what they thought. They were totally off on a number of different issues. But here in chapter 38 and through 41, God's speaking. So there better not be anything that we see that would be an error, or else that's a problem with the Creator saying something wrong, right? But we know that in looking at it, we haven't seen anything, and there has not been any discoveries that I'm aware of that would cause us to doubt what God says here, as far as the things he's saying. And of course, in this chapter, his point that he's making, he's not really trying to give Job a science lesson. He's not trying to really talk about the way, he doesn't get into specifics of the way things work or everything. What he's really trying to do is two things. He's trying to show Job that he's the creator and that he is sovereign over the natural order of the universe, and then also that he's sovereign over the moral order of the universe, basically in response to Job questioning those things. Now, Job didn't come out and say specifically that I know more than God knows or anything like that, but he was questioning God's justice and the way things work. So the point is really that he's making is to just really bombard Job with questions that show how little he knows compared to what the things that he's saying, what he's really doing. We kind of talked a little bit about that. Are we ever guilty of what you might call arrogance or thinking that we know more than what we actually know? Of course, I think probably all of us have been guilty of that from time to time and continue to be so. And we really have to keep the right attitude and think about things as we go. But here God really emphasizes how little people know. And I really emphasized last week, even though he doesn't, nothing that he says really goes into detail of things that we've learned since Job, since the story of Job, still, we may think that we know a lot more, but we don't know much still. Like there's still things that we think we know, we probably will find that we don't know later on. Scientists and things, things that there's lots of things that people seem to think that they know and may not be the case. So anyway, I think the point being just that we need to make sure that we keep the proper perspective on those things. Now, at the end of chapter 38, I don't know that the chapter break is real great. I think it probably should have ended at the end of verse 38, because in 38, God's basically focusing on what I would call earth science, or, he talks about the creation of the universe. And like I mentioned last week, even though the timing here, a lot of it seems like it's talking about creation, some of it, I read an author that talks about how the first 7 or 8 verses are talking about creation. Then there's a section that talks about the flood, which you could see in verses 9 through 11 there, that it could be actually referring to the flood, although that also could refer to creation, either way. But once you get into verse 12 and beyond that, really the author was saying that God's speaking to Job based on the way that the world is at the time. Like things he's saying are based on the way Job sees it, like what actually is there. So, and we'll see that in chapter 39, like we start talking about animals, and there are certain animals that God mentions that we don't have today, that are extinct. But the indication is we're alive at the time that God's talking to Job here. But so anyway, here at the end, beginning in verse 39 of chapter 38, we start talking about animals. And if one of you guys back there would want to read chapter 38, starting in 39, and go through 38, and going through chapter 39, verse 8.
When the dust hardens into a mass and the clods stick together, can you hunt the prey for the lion or satisfy the appetite of the young lions? When they crouch in their dens and lie in wait in their lair, who prepares for the raven its nourishment when its young cries to God and wander about without food? Okay. Do you know the time the mountain goats give birth? Do you observe the calving of the deers? Can you count the months they fulfill? Or do you know the time they give birth? They kneel down, they bring forth their young, they get rid of their labor pains. Their offsprings become strong, they grow up in the open field, they leave and do not return to them. Who sends out the wild donkey free? Who set out the wild donkey free? And who loosed the bonds of the swift donkey? To whom I give the wilderness for a home, and the salt land for his dwelling place. He scorns the tumult of the city, and the shouting of the driver he does not hear. He explores the mountain for his pasture and searches after everything green thing.
Okay. Thank you, Terry. All right, so beginning in this verse and continuing, like I said, on through chapter 39, God uses animals as examples of Job's ignorance. And in the first verses here in 39 through 41, he asks Job if he understands the way that lions and ravens get their food. Now, something interesting as we go through this, something that I thought about, and I think we talked about it before. You know, the way the Bible is written and the things that God says, if I were a person trying to prove to you how much I know, I don't know that this is the way I would, I wouldn't necessarily do it the way God's doing it here. It's like, I think it shows how that the Bible doesn't come from a person. Because it's very simple things, but yet things that, at least at the time, he didn't know. And what he's saying here, you're not able to observe enough to even see how these animals get their food, but I created them, is the implication, and I know how everything works. Then you go on, and he does it again here in verses 1 through 4 of chapter 39, how, he asks, do you understand how goats and deer reproduce? Of course, Job doesn't know the life cycles of these animals because he wasn't able to observe them. Like I said, now today we know more. I still would argue that we don't know everything or even close to everything, but we know more about the life cycles because we've been able to observe them through the use of technology or people going out in the wild and actually observing it. But they lived out in the wild, so Job didn't see how these things happen. But of course, here again, what's the implication? God sees it. God knows what happens. Verses 5 through 8, God asked Job who it is that provided the wilderness for the donkey to live in. Implication again, of course, God. He also provides some little things, some tidbits about the characteristics that he put into the donkey. And we'll see that again as we go through some of these animals. There are characteristics that God provides just that maybe Job and the people of that day didn't know. Or that they could observe, and therefore they did observe them, and then he's using that as saying, I created it that way. So two different things there. All right, let's go ahead and read 9 through 12.
Will the wild ox consent to serve you, or will he spend the night at your manger? Can you bind the wild ox in a furrow with ropes? Or will he harrow the valleys after you? Will you trust him because his strength is great, or leave your labor to him? Will you have faith in him that he will return your grain and gather it from the threshing floor.
Does anybody have a different version here that uses anything different for this animal? Does everybody say wild ox?
I do, but I didn't bring my Bible back.
All right, some versions, I believe, say unicorn here. So there's debate about that, like is it referring to the mythical unicorn that is in fairy tales or in fantasy stories. I don't necessarily think that that's the case, because when the way you look at all these animals and think about it is, what's the description of them? How's it described? So Wayne Jackson, in the book that I was using for some of the material here, says that many scholars believe the word here refers to a large fierce ox of the ancient world that is now extinct. The translators of the Septuagint rendered the word rehin by the Greek term monoceros, which would be one horn, and that's on the basis of representations of the wild ox that they found in Babylonian and Egyptian art. Either way, it's what's God doing here? What's he doing talking about this wild ox or unicorn? What's the point he's making?
Job doesn't understand.
Doesn't understand it, and he's also comparing it to a domesticated ox, right? Yeah. People would use oxen in their farming to help with harvesting or other things, and that's where in verse 12 he says, will you have faith in him that he will return your grain and gather it from your threshing floor? So to me, it seems that this is more like almost like a rhinoceros. The description sounds like a rhinoceros, which has one horn, so unicorn could make sense in that case, more so than a horse. But either way, he's comparing an animal that can be domesticated and used versus a wild animal that people could not use at all, or harvest, or harness, I should say. All right, let's go to 13 through 18 then.
The ostrich wings flap joyously with the pinion and plumage of love, for she abandons her eggs to the earth and warms them in the dust. And she forgets that a foot may crush them, or that a wild beast may trample them. She treats her young cruelly as if they were not here. Though her labor be in vain, she is unconcerned, because God has made her forget wisdom, and he has not given her a share of understanding. When she lifts herself on high, she laughs at the horse and his rider.
A couple of things here. God discusses some interesting facts about the ostrich. Does anybody here, again, it sounds like everybody's kind of on the same version here, but there is, I think the King James Version actually says peacock. And most everybody that I read says that that's not a good translation, because I don't think that the description of the way the behavior or the flapping or anything like that doesn't fit with a peacock. It's an ostrich. It's a little odd in that God's not asking Job anything here. In the previous sections, everything, it's always like, do you know this? Do you know that? But now he starts just discussing the ostrich. And also, there's a place where, and I didn't look into this because I didn't really think too much of it, but where he actually talks about himself in third person. In verse 17, because God has made her forget wisdom. So that's an interesting place there. But he talks about how the ostrich joyously flaps its wings. Obviously, the ostrich can't fly, so I think that he's making a point about the flapping, but it can't fly. There's no reason for it to flap, really. And both of the commentaries that I read said that the plumage of love is a reference to the stork, who everybody's seen cartoons, right, with the stork bringing the baby. So why is that? Why is the stork used in those cartoons to bring a baby? besides the obvious that they don't want to tell kids about things, but
That's how babies are raised.
yeah, exactly. So besides that point of it, why is the stork used? Because the stork is affectionate toward its young, and it takes care of the young, sits on the nest, and takes care of them. Probably could have used another number of birds in that instance other than the stork, but the stork was known for that, I guess. But the ostrich, what does the ostrich do? Lays its eggs and leaves them, right? Just lets them go. Even though the ostrich may not be a genius, and it looks like, or it may seem like a bad thing to us, that's it. You know, they're on their own once that's done. There's actually purpose behind that. Yeah, some of the eggs do get destroyed, but in the end, that leaves food for the hatchlings, the ones that do hatch. So there are, and some things that we might consider to be not so good, or you look at it and say, well, that's not an affectionate bird or whatever, actually ends up further, doing what it needs to do in order for the young to have to grow and become adults. Also, it's noted that ostriches, where is it here? She laughs at the horse and his rider. Now, why is that put in there? Ostrich is a bird, right? Flaps its wings but doesn't fly. But it can run faster than a horse, right? Or at least as fast as a horse. I don't know. I forget. I didn't look it up to see which one's faster, but I know the ostrich is the fastest bird for sure. But anyway, so ostriches are fast. So now it's referencing to a horse and comparing to a horse. And that's where we go into, let's do 19 through 25.
Do you give the horse his might? Do you clothe his neck with a mane? Do you make him leap like the locust? His majestic snorting is terrible. He paws in the valley and rejoices in his strength. He goes out to meet the weapons. He laughs at fear and is not dismayed, and he does not turn back from the sword. The quiver rattles against him, the flashing spear and javelin. When shaking and rage, he races over the ground, and he does not stand still at the voice of the trumpet. How much more you want? Okay. As often as the trumpet sounds, he says, "Aha."
So God's comparison of the ostrich to the horse leads into a question. So here's the question. God asked Job if he created the horse with all of its characteristics. I think God mentions the characteristics of these animals to emphasize that Job, or any person, didn't come up with the design that allows them to do the things they do. So kind of the argument, and this probably is at least in the Bible, where you in school they teach the theory of evolution, right? And then what was the opposite of that the people wanted taught? Creation, intelligent design, right? That something designed Earth and the things that we see. So here God's kind of doing that. He's saying, did a person design this? And in the case of the horse, he emphasizes that horses are courageous, fast, and strong. So what did they use horses for because of those characteristics? To be used in battle, yep. So he's just pointing out those characteristics. Let's go on to finish 39 here, 26 through 30.
It is by your understanding that the hawk soars, stretching his wings toward the south. Is it at your command that the eagle mounts up and makes his nest on high, or the cliff he dwells and lodges upon the rocky crag, an inaccessible place? From there, he spies out food, his eyes see it from afar. His young ones also suck up blood, and when the slain are, there is he.
Okay, so What birds are described here? First off, what's used here?
Predators.
Predators, the hawk, certainly. The eagle. And the last part there doesn't really describe an eagle, I think. It's what bird would that chapter, verse 30 sound like to you?
I got it right here on the tip of my tongue.
Vultures, right? Yeah, so that sounds like a vulture, the ones that go after things that are already dead and clean those up. So I don't know about that. It kind of seems like that, maybe where it says eagle, it might, I mean, certainly eagles nest in cliffs and lodges and rocky crags. They spy out their food from afar. We've seen what eagles do when they swoop down into a lake and see a fish under the water. So their eyesight. So he's talking about the eagle's eyesight, talking about a hawk, how high it can soar. Did people fly at this time? They understand anything about flight? No, we didn't. They didn't even. We didn't understand airplanes at all, or how to create lift until the early 1900s, right? That's when the Wright brothers did their first flight. So how long ago is that? That's only, what, 120 years. So 120 years we've been flying. Up until then, we didn't understand enough to do that. So God, he also asked Job if he understands why the birds fly to the south, right? He talks about the hawk facing south, the migratory patterns that they have. So anyway, once again, just everything emphasizes the lack of knowledge that Job had. Why would God be doing that? Why is he emphasizing how little Job knows?
Maybe to let Job know what God knows.
To let him know who's in charge, really.
Yeah, who's the boss?
Yeah, because what's been happening throughout the discussion that Job's been having with the others here.
The thing he had something to do.
He's been questioning the rightness of it. He's been blaming God for the things that have happened. And as we've talked about, was he right in blaming God? Yeah, I mean, God's in control, but some of the things that he was saying weren't accurate. And of course, we talked about his friends or critics or whatever you want to call them. Certainly, a lot of what they were saying was not accurate either. So,
Well, Job didn't really know why.
What was happening to him was happening.
right? Yeah, he had no knowledge of it. So that was the problem. They were all speaking without knowledge, which is the point. What?
David's free will.
Right.
So, of course,
He's going to think what he's thinking.
Right. He was just it's just misunderstanding what's going on. And the point, I think that's the point God's really driving home is, you don't know. You can't know. I'm the creator. You can't know these things. So I think that's really kind of the point he was making. So in Job 40, chapter 40, God continues to emphasize how little Job knows and how little power he has by asking him more questions about his creation. And this is where we're going to focus on two creatures of immense size and power, the behemoth and then the Leviathan in chapter 41. But first, we're going to read verses 1 through 5, just to see, because God takes a little break on the questioning here for a moment.
will the fault
Contend with the Almighty? Let him who reproves God answer it. Then Job answered at the Lord and said, Behold, I am insignificant, but can I reply to you? I lay my hand on my mouth. Once I have spoken, and I will not answer even twice, and I will add nothing more.
Well, he does ask one question here. He says, do you want to continue to proceed with this trial that you had wanted? Job wanted the opportunity to present his case against God. If you go back to chapter 13, he had mentioned that. And he had been accusing God of treating him unfairly. So at this point, what does Job do? Why does Job respond that way? Behold, I am insignificant. What can I reply to thee? I lay my hand on my mouth. Once I have spoken, and I will not answer, even twice, and I will add no more.
He knows he was wrong.
Is that what he's saying? I'm not gonna say anything else because I was wrong.
Maybe he wants to hear more.
I think at this point,
That's why he's not speaking.
I think he's completely caught up in utter confusion. I mean, keep in mind too, he has lost everything.
Mm-hmm.
Still.
Yeah, this hasn't. What God's just done doesn't change anything about the situation.
Exactly right. What God's saying here doesn't take away the fact that, him talking about birds and deer and, giving birth, animals giving birth. I think at this point he's like, okay, I wasn't there, but what's your point? He still lost every one of his children. He lost his livelihood. He lost his home. He lost his health. His wife was standing there to accuse him. Most likely she's gone at this point. He lost everything.
Yeah, well,
I think this isn't bringing comfort to him. I think it's bringing confusion at this point.
That's possible. I'm not really sure exactly why he says it the way he does, but basically what he's indicating is I'm not going to say anything else because I'm not going to say anything else that is wrong. Like I'm done. I think he's admitting that he was wrong to me. I mean, it kind of seems like, okay, yeah, I get your point, but like you were saying, like it still doesn't answer any of the questions that he's had. Like why is this happening to me? Okay, yeah, you're in charge. I'm insignificant, but what?
I think if God...
If he believes that Job believes in him, he shouldn't be asking any questions.
Well, I don't know about that because God pointed Job out and he said, look at my servant. And he allowed this to happen to Job to prove a point. Who was he proving the point to? Yeah, not to Job, it was to the devil, right? That he's showing, because God started this whole thing. He pointed Job out to the devil and allowed the devil to do the things that he did. But yeah, I mean, I think to me it's almost like what else can I say at this point?
It's impossible to put ourselves in his shoes, but I would be thinking, in my own mind when I read this, I'd be thinking if I say anything at this point, God clearly is shutting my mouth. Mm-hmm. I'm just going to help speed that process up and shut my own, because if I open it any more, is he going to strike me down?
Yeah. I mean,
It could be he's consenting and he just doesn't know.
Yeah, he might not know. But I definitely think it's a good point that Jimmy made about how at this point it still doesn't answer any of Job's questions. I think that's key.
Nor does it bring any comfort.
No, yeah, and doesn't offer any comfort. I think it puts Job in his place as far as understanding. Yeah, I don't get it. I'm not God. I can't get there.
Yeah, I'm not you.
Yeah, I think it's gotten there, but I don't know that he totally understands what's going on yet. Nor at the end of the conversation am I sure that he does, as we'll see as we get through here. Because I don't think God's point at this point is not, at this juncture, is not to bring comfort to Job. It's to clarify some things, I think.
Not really wanting to bring
Him any more pain either, is he?
No, he's not. He's not bringing him pain. He's not bringing him comfort. He's just clarifying what's going on to some degree. But he still doesn't tell Job what's actually happening.
He didn't tell him.
It's only amazing why he did it.
No. All right, so let's go ahead and do 6 through 14 then.
Then the Lord answered Job out of the cloud and said, Now gird up your loins like a man. I will ask you, and you instruct me. Will you really annul my judgment? Will you condemn me, that you may be justified? Or do you have an arm like God? And can you thunder with a voice like his? Adorn yourself with eminence and dignity, and clothe yourself with honor and majesty. Pour out the overflowings of your anger, and look at everyone who is proud, and make him low. Look on everyone who is proud, and humble him, and tread down the wicked where they stand. Hide them in the dust together, bind them in the hidden place. then I will also confess to you that your own right hand can save you.
All right, so there's a lot there that I'm not going to take a long time to go over, though. But since Job is unwilling to speak again, and basically says, that's it for me, God continues to question him. And he asks him if he will discredit God's judgment. I think the point here is that God's saying, at least the way I translate it, is kind of, you may not have realized what you were doing when you were challenging or saying basically that I'm unjust. You may not have known it, but now he's kind of bringing it out like this is what you were doing, what was happening, and if you can actually, he's actually now challenging Job to prove his charge, that God's unjust. Job had in effect argued that he was more just than God by saying that God was treating him unfairly. And I don't know, and of course I don't think Job really realized, we've talked about this before, when you're in the middle of pain and suffering and then you get into this kind of a discussion with people, you're going to sometimes say things that you haven't thought through the entire conclusion. Have you ever tried to argue with somebody who won't accept facts? Like doesn't argue from logic, but argues from feeling or from what they want to have happen, or won't accept the facts? You can't.
I find that with the elderly more than many
People.
Because they're set in their ways. You mean,
well,
or
no matter what you say, they got something to say about it that's different from what even though you're right, they can't accept that.
All right, I'll tell you where I remember it is when I was a kid. My parents couldn't convince me of things whenever we would argue. I would challenge them on every instance. Any parents have that problem with their kids, challenging and not accepting the facts when you're discussing it with them? So I would see it on the opposite side, but you could see it with people who are older because they might be set in their ways, or they might think they know it all. Some might. That's possible. Hopefully we don't think that way. Hopefully we realize that we don't know it all just because we've had experience or whatever. But basically, I don't think Job had thought through some of the things that he had said completely, and that's to be expected because his friends are accusing him of things that he didn't do. He's hurting, he's struggling, so I think that would be expected. But remember that whenever Job challenged God and said that he's treating him unfairly, remember that's what Elihu spent that whole section that we went through with Elihu speaking. That's what made him so mad. Even though Elihu came to an incorrect conclusion as well and was wrong in what he was saying, he didn't like Job challenging God's justice. So anyway, God's challenging Job to prove his charge. And he says if Job is more righteous than God, then he should also be more powerful than God, right? And he asks if he has a voice like God's voice. Now remember, what's happening as God says this? When he says, do you have a voice as God has?
He's enabling him to speak.
Yeah? But where's God speaking from? He's speaking out of a cloud or a thunderstorm or some kind of a whirlwind. So how would that have sounded to the people that were there? Like put yourself there and like, what's going on here? Think about the situation. So if you're hearing God speak out of a storm and then God says, do you have a voice like mine? He's actually hearing it, right? And God suggests that if Job is so just, he should also be able to do a better job of running the universe, which is what God had just described to some degree, the way the universe works. Very simple, in a very simple form, but that's what he did. And then he also says that Job should be able to execute justice against the wicked, and that if Job can do a perfect job of that, he'll say how great Job is. So why wouldn't Job be able to do a perfect job of executing justice against the wicked? He's not God, right? Yeah, that's very true. But think about what's involved in that. The justice system in the United States is considered to be, the fairest that there has been in history. Has there ever been anybody convicted wrongly? Has anybody ever been executed when they shouldn't have been? Especially today, are people being charged with things that they shouldn't be charged with? I'm noticing anyway. To do a perfect job of executing justice, what do you have to be able to do?
See and know everything.
You have to know everything, and you have to know what somebody's thinking, right? What's the motivation behind what's done? We've talked about that. There are times where the same action can be right or wrong depending on why it was done. I like to use the simple illustration that doesn't cause anybody to have an argument or anything, but like if somebody, you guys remember, if anybody who's been in my class probably, if somebody takes the last piece of chocolate pie from the buffet before you get there, did they do something wrong? No, you would say no, right? But what if they don't like chocolate pie, but they knew you did, and that's the only reason they took the chocolate pie?
Yeah, but how would you know?
Exactly. You wouldn't know unless you did know that, and you can't know everything in every instance. So basically God's telling Job, unless you know and are able to know everything and able to see into somebody's heart and what they're thinking, you can't do a perfect job of executing justice. And therefore, what your argument was doesn't hold. It doesn't work. So anyway, I think that's the point that he's making, is that, if you could do that, then you would be equal to me, but you can't. You can't do that. All right, we got a little bit of time. I don't think we'll probably get through this, but we can go ahead and read it, I guess. You want to read 15 through 24?
So God goes back to now
Discussing one of his creations to further his point. Go ahead.
Behold now, behemoth, which I made as well as you. He eats grass like an ox. Behold now his strength in his loins, and his power in the muscles of his belly. He bends his tail like a cedar, in sinews of his size, and knits together. His bones are tubes of bronze. His limbs are like bars of iron. He is the first of the ways of God. Let his maker bring near his sword. Surely the mountains bring him food, and all the beasts of the field play there. Under the lotus plants he lies down, in the covert of the reeds and the marsh. The lotus plants covers him with shade. The willows of the brook surround him. If a river rages, he is not alarmed. He is confident, though the Jordan rushes in his mouth. Can anyone capture him when he is on watch? With barbs can anyone pierce his nose?
So, like I said, we only have a couple minutes here, so I'm not going to really dive into this, but God now uses the behemoth to emphasize his power, and the emphasis is that he created the behemoth just like he created humans. So he puts Job in the same category as a creation of God. The word behemoth is the plural form of beast, but in Job 40, it is used with singular verbs and pronouns. So like if you're reading the original, it would be like, instead of saying they, it says it or him or what, and that emphasizes that it's a great beast, basically, like that it's the largeness or whatever. And of course, there's always been a debate about what is being discussed here in this passage. And I remember it being a pretty big deal when I was a kid, and I don't think it's as big of a discussion now. I don't hear it as much, but I remember it was at one point. And God says that behemoth is an animal that eats grass like an ox. It's extremely strong, has a tail like a cedar tree, and a skeleton like a framework of brass and iron. It is chief in size and might of all God's creation. So it sounds like it eats a lot of plants, but other animals are able to roam around it without fear. It talks about how the proximity of them. Sounds like it was either tall enough to walk on the bottom of a river and still have its head above water, and or it was strong enough to swim against the tide. Or even maybe that it can go underwater. I'm not sure exactly how you would translate that. So anyway, that's the description on it. Like I said, we're not going to go into it any further here, but that's where we'll pick up and discuss what the behemoth is and what God's saying here. All right, we'll be back in 15 minutes for worship, and